So the last presentation of the day will be from Greg Richards, who's a professor of placemaking at Breda University and the University of Tilburg, both in the Netherlands. He's worked on multiple projects for numerous national governments, national tourism organizations, and municipalities, and he has extensive experience in tourism and leisure research and education. Greg's talk today will focus on the potential of cultural and creative tourism for placemaking. Cultural tourism has traditionally been viewed as a means of attracting visitors to places with culture, so they can stimulate economic growth through passive consumption. New views of the relationship between culture, people, and places are emerging that emphasize the potential for tourists, visitors, and residents, and other place users to actively collaborate in making places that improve the quality of life. So please don't forget to add your questions in the Q&A to Greg, and I am going to pass it over to him.
Right, thanks a lot. Well, I hope you can hear me, and with any luck, you might also be able to see my presentation. That's always the big fear of this Zoom era, that the camera or the presentation or both doesn't work, but let's keep our fingers crossed.
It's all looking good, Greg.
Good, that's a good start. I just wanted to say something briefly about cultural and creative tourism as a kind of coda to this session. I mean, I know that Ontario has a long tradition of developing cultural tourism. It's been one of the leading exponents of selling culture to tourists since the 1980s. And from what I've heard today, there's no shortage of creativity and ideas going into the pivoting of culture and tourism during the pandemic. But what I would like to argue for is for an even more creative and perhaps an even wider view of the relationship between culture and creativity and tourism from the perspective of placemaking. Basically, what we've seen in recent decades is a change in the nature of culture and tourism. And so you could argue we've gone from a traditional model of high culture being consumed by the cultural elite, or cultural tourism 1.0, to the idea of culture and cultural tourism as an engine for economic growth, attracting hordes of tourists to city centres across the world, and particularly in places like Amsterdam and Venice, where they've been complaining until recently about over-tourism. But I think in recent years, we've also seen a new phase in this relationship, which we could call cultural tourism 3.0, which is a much more integrated form of cultural tourism, where the tourist is no longer the passive consumer, but is also a producer of their own experiences, whether it's by posting things on social media or through much more active experiences. And arguably, we're now moving into an even more interesting phase, the arrival of which has been hastened by the pandemic, which is this development of hybrid, creolized contexts for tourism and culture, and the rise of what we might call e-cultural tourism actors. So wherever you look on the internet these days, you'll see curated cultural and cultural tourism experiences being put together by curators. And so suddenly we were able to access this vast array of culture and creativity virtually. So you could go and join Grayson's art club without any problem at all. So we're now into a new situation, which our panelists in the previous sessions have been talking about, where we're in the digital pivot. We're thinking about how to link digital and real experiences, but we have new possibilities with the growth of what we might call extensive reality. And this is all part of a wider economic development from the service economy towards the experience economy, and I would argue now a transformational economy. So we've gone through tourism as a service to cultural tourism, which is really about experiencing culture as a tourist, to a more creative idea of tourism, which is the idea that one can become something different through the experiences that you have while you're traveling. And the interesting thing about this for places is that this can also increase the value of those experiences as well. So if we translate this into a placemaking context, then really what this is about the resources that we've been used to using for cultural tourism being transformed and given new meanings for tourists and for local residents. And that requires the application of creativity. And I'll try and show you a bit about what I mean. If you read Italo Calvino's novel, Mr. Palomar, this is all about meaning. It's about the meaning of life and the meaning that can be found in very, very ordinary things. And Mr. Palomar, traveling to Paris, compares the cheese shop he sees with the Louvre. The cheese shop, just like the Louvre, displays objects produced by a civilization. And this is an interesting analogy which reveals the everyday creativity which can be accessed by places to develop cultural and creative experiences, and of course as a support for tourism development as well. So, you know, it's not just the cheese shop as museum, it's also people taking these ideas and turning them into reality. So Nicolas Boulard in France has developed what he calls the Cheese Museum, which displays the architectural forms that can be found in cheese. So he has turned cheese into an art and developed a museum in which to show this new form of art. And when you take these kind of ideas to their kind of logical conclusion, then of course what you are doing is highlighting particular bits of culture and creativity as being worthy of attention. And if you do that, then you will find there are other people who are also interested in these things. It's not just crazy artists who do this stuff. He managed to persuade people to put on silly capes and hats and join him in the confrérie of specific cheeses. Now, this may seem like some kind of rather crazy fanaticism, but actually this is the kind of interest and desire which drives the development of new rituals and practices. And this is where the ideas for new forms of tourism also come from. And so we could ask the question whether, you know, art is in fact imitating life. And if you go to Poland, for example, you can find in Katowice that the whole tourist economy has been built on the cheese products of the local region. And my colleague Karina Wren has written at some length about the role of cheese as an actor in tourism systems. And so it's no longer about resources which are simply in a place which are made available to tourists. No, it is about those things becoming active participants in a system of tourism consumption and production. So we can use mundane things like cheese to drive cultural tourism and creative tourism experiences. So what we're really talking about is a change in the nature of cultural tourism. So museums used to be places where we would put things which were actually out of place because they were in the museum rather than in living culture, to the idea of giving culture back to places. So places are now increasingly thinking about their cultural DNA and how they can creatively use that to distinguish themselves from other places and attract people. And most of the interesting concepts in cultural development and tourism development come from these kind of ideas, the linking of culture and creativity in place. And we talk about concepts like provenance and terroir and identity and cuisine. And these are the kind of things that you will now find in cultural tourism promotion brochures all over the world. And this really gives an idea of the power of place as a central concept in the development of cultural tourism. And so the act of travel itself has the potential for the creative displacement of people to rediscover the interesting things in the culture of others, and in the current pandemic, their own culture as well. So we're seeing the emergence of a whole range of new tourism niches, of a range of cultural and creative tourism experiences, which one can now see bubbling up wherever you go. So things like street art, the seemingly ubiquitous emergence of craft beer and breweries, creative tourism experiences, and interestingly, in the previous panel, we had the Nuit Blanche coming up as a new concept, gastronomic tourism, new urban tourism, and the tourist in your own city, which predates the pandemic. This was already a thing in the 1990s, but it was fairly small scale and seen as fringe rather than mainstream. And now, of course, with the pandemic, we have all become tourists in our own city, and we have rediscovered the places that we live in. So these are some interesting ideas, but how do they work in places? And in an Ontario context, the role of small cities in driving creative and cultural change is, I think, particularly interesting. And we've been looking for the last 10 years or so at examples in the Netherlands, and particularly focusing on the small city of Den Bosch, which nobody outside the Netherlands had ever heard of until a few years ago, when they decided to develop a program related to the art of Hieronymus Bosch, who was a famous medieval painter and the most famous son of Den Bosch as a place. But Den Bosch had a big creative handicap, because there were no artworks. There are no artworks by Hieronymus Bosch in the city itself. So they faced a big hurdle. How do you get artworks that you don't own to a city to try and interest people in the commemoration of the 500th anniversary of his death, and make sure that you can attract lots of cultural tourists? And this is where the creativity really came in. They used storytelling, the idea of Den Bosch as the home of the medieval painter, and therefore as the natural home of his art. And they created a research and restoration project for his art, and they engaged other cities in this project. And that way they managed to secure the loan of a significant number of his surviving paintings to manage to stage this impressive retrospective exhibition, which ended up attracting 420,000 people to a very small city. And the whole program that they built around this event attracted 1.5 million people. And it was a holistic process of placemaking, because, of course, you can't do this just on an exhibition, which you can only get a limited number of people through. You also have to give people something to do when they go into the city. So they developed nighttime light shows. They developed sculptures displaying the art of Hieronymus Bosch. They engaged school children by making artworks related to the painter. They had a parade of boats themed in Hieronymus Bosch style on the local river, and so on. And so this was something which engaged people from the whole city, but also put the city on the map globally. So suddenly they were in the media, they were being recognized by people from outside as well as from the inside. And in order to do this, you really need a holistic placemaking concept. This was not driven by people from the tourism sector. This was driven by the cultural sector, by and large. And so the tourism people reluctantly followed when they saw that people were actually going to turn up. And even more reluctantly, the commercial sector followed as well when they saw that the restaurants were filling up, the terraces were full, and so on. So it's something which requires a considerable effort, but it can have a significant impact for even a small place like Den Bosch. And we can see that creativity is an increasingly important part of this kind of development. The idea of creative tourism has been around for quite a while, but we're now seeing the concept spreading around the world. You can do a variety of different creative activities and experiences in many different places around the world. And we're now seeing a particular push by the Creative Tourism Network to do things in French, which produces a slightly different twist on the whole experience, and of course is interesting in a Canadian context. But the whole idea of this, of course, is that it doesn't just involve people having creative experiences. It involves making connections between people. So people might come because they're interested in a particular creative activity, but they come back because they have made connections with people with whom they share creative passions. So that is one of the interesting kind of longer term benefits of creative tourism. And in the pandemic, we've seen a lot of the techniques of creativity being applied even in the tourism sector. We've seen places all over the world, as I've heard discussed in Ontario, catering for the staycation market, but realizing that you have to do something creative and something new for those people. So creative tourism and injecting creativity into tourism is one way of doing this, because then you are, rather like Mr. Palomar, beginning to see everyday things with new eyes and realizing the richness and creative depth that is on your doorstep. So I think this is one of the keys to how you will make this kind of step change from the enforced reliance on the staycation or the regional market into broader markets as they come on stream, because the creative experiences that you can develop now for the local or regional market will also be engaging for those other markets later on. So I think we've run out of time, and I will have to stop my story there. But if you want to find out more about the relationship between placemaking and culture and creative tourism, then there's a lot of material on my website and on my ResearchGate page. So feel free to download as much as you can manage. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Greg. And thank you for that offer of downloading content. I know I'm always looking for things that I can get and access online. So that's great. Feel free definitely to put your questions and comments to Greg in the chat. We're seeing a lot of people saying great inspiration. Yeah, thank you very much. They love the presentation. Someone's asking about the websites again. We will package up everyone's information, including the contact information and the slides, and you'll be able to get that probably in the next week or so. We'll be able to send everything from all the presentations over the past few days. One of our comments here in the Q&A is, it is more of a comment. They're coming from the Ingersoll Cheese Museum, which is in Ontario. And they're saying that this has sparked a lot of ideas. They're part of the Oxford County Cheese Trail, and they're recommending you go check it out if you haven't heard from it already. someone talks about these sense of place exercises, and what do you recommend to really get at this with your community and destination? Like, how do you get the community to really figure out what that sense of place is for them?
Well, I think people don't do a lot of talking about their place to each other, because we all live in our places and we take it for granted. So the interesting thing about the development of creative tourism is that it begins to illustrate to people what other people find interesting about their place. And suddenly people go, oh, yeah, cheese, that's interesting. So I think it's a lot about communication, about talking to people from the place, and also using tourists as a resource, because usually we're too busy asking them what they want for dinner or whether they've had a good time. But do we actually ask them about what they found interesting or engaging about a place?
Yeah, I think that it's an untapped resource for sure. You were speaking a little bit about the terroir of a place, and how do we recreate that when we're offering virtual experiences?
It's very difficult, but I did an interesting exercise with my students, which was I asked them to make virtual tours to different places. And there we saw an enormous range of different types of digital experiences, and an enormous range in the level of engagement that you can get. So we had some reactions which were very, very positive, which were basically those experiences which enabled the visitor to interact and to guide themselves through the experience, but which also gave a little bit of background to what people were seeing. Because one of the things that really amazed me about most of the cultural experiences that were being offered online, they said almost nothing about the context. So you would go into the Louvre, for example, and you're just in a room, and that's it. So the normal idea of a curator, of telling you a story about why the things are there in this particular room, it's completely missing in many cases. So I think that there's many things that can be done to improve the digital experiences that are around.
Absolutely. I know I've done some.
And we'll just stand by until Megan comes back. So sorry for that, Greg.
That's all right.
I'm actually, while we wait for her to come back, is there maybe to talk a bit more, any other examples from your students about capturing other experiences of place and in their virtual tours?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what engages people is being able to move around in space, not necessarily indoors, but also moving around outdoors is a good thing to try. I mean, it's interesting because I was talking to some people the other day about the way in which culture has moved out of the museum. So this is something that's been going on since the early 1990s. But the idea that one needs to be inside the museum to experience culture is something that we should be getting away from. So I don't understand why museums insist on having tours which are all inside. We might also want to see where the museum is. How do you link the museum to the place that it is located in?
Excellent. And with that, I think we have Ruth Burns standing by. So I will throw it over to you, Ruth. Thanks so much, Greg.
Thank you.